Part of preparing for this unit exam is first going over your notes. Okay, first going over your notes, looking at your lab reports and things like that. And then, okay, when you've reviewed everything thoroughly, you've done some diagrams of the cell and things like that, then you can look at the practice exam. Okay, don't do the practice exam first. All that'll tell you is that you don't know enough yet. Okay, study a little bit first, then try the practice exam. Okay, then it'll tell you basically what areas you still need to study. Right, that's the purpose of it, so make sure you use it in that fashion. The review sheet, okay, is somewhat useful. At least it tells you kind of what things to focus on. Okay, and then today I'll give you a little bit more detail on what things you need to focus on in preparation for this unit exam. So the unit exam will be the same format as the chem unit exam. So there'll be some multiple choice questions, a little bit more because biology lends itself a little better to that. Okay, so there'll be a few more multiple choice questions, and then there'll be some written response questions. They will be much different than the chem questions were. The chem questions were mostly demonstrate this skill, show me you can still do this. Whereas these questions are going to be, here's a situation a living organism finds itself in, explain what's going on or how this relates to plant transport or how this relates to cellular transport or something like that. So when you're preparing for biology, you have to know your material. So you got to do a lot of reading review. Okay, sometimes people make like little recipe cards, little flashcards. Okay, to help them with that. It's not a bad idea. But you also have to be able to anticipate what kind of questions is Mr. Coderre going to ask. Okay, and I've along the way said, I'd really probably ask a question like this when I'm talking about this particular concept or whatever. Okay, so when you're going over like parts of the cell, obviously, yeah, there'll be a diagram of the cell on the unit exam, but you need to be able to know more than just what the parts of the cell are. Okay, I could give you a situational question where, here's some snails that are swimming around in a sea of salt. What would happen to them based on cell transport? And you would have to tell me. Okay, then you're incorporating, a little bit more. You're making connections and you're coming up with some of your own ideas. Okay, those are the kinds of things that will happen here. In terms of answers in biology, there's a delicate balance to your answers. And that delicate balance falls somewhere between saying too little and saying so much that you contradict yourself. Okay? Your answers in biology need to be concise, but detailed. Okay? But you do have to watch that you don't contradict yourself. What I mean by that is, if I give you a question, that shows a picture of a plant that's got a weird shape, okay, and I ask you, here's the situation this plant is in, which tropism would this be, and how does that work? Okay, you don't want to talk so much that at the start of the question you were telling me it was geotropism, and by the end of the question it was thigmotropism. Okay, because then I'm going to look at that and go, this person has no idea what they're talking about. Okay, or they don't know what the answer is, so they wrote everything they know in hopes that some of it will be right. And unfortunately, you can't do that in biology. Okay, I mean, yeah, if I wrote down everything I knew for a question, probably some of it would relate, but it doesn't tell me that I knew anything about that question. I just wrote down everything I knew. Okay, so you got to find that delicate balance there that says, here's what it is. I made a decision, and I'm going to tell you what I know about that, as opposed to, I'm going to tell you what I know about that and these three other things in the hope you'll feel pity for me. I have no pity. Okay, so make sure that you are, choosing an answer. All right, concepts that we went over. First off, we started off with the cell theory. And very much like in the last unit, there'll be a couple of multiple choice questions about the important people. Okay, in this unit, there's really only 4 important people. That makes it a bit easier than the structure of the atom. Okay, so the important people are Hooke. Okay, he's the guy who found the cells in the cork. Okay, and then Leeuwenhoek, who was the first person to look at living cells. And then we had Schleiden and Schwann, the 2 guys who found that cells were part of all living organisms and proposed the original cell theory. Okay. So know, kind of one of those points of detail for each one so that you could recognize them as the correct answer for a multiple choice item. All right, so like we said, this would be definite multiple choice material, okay? Not something I'm going to waste a 5-mark question on in the written response. Okay. Being able to estimate the size of an object using the microscope. Okay, there was something that we really struggled with on our lab diagrams in this unit, but it is an important skill that you must demonstrate. So I could easily have a multiple choice question that shows a picture of a cell. Okay, so let's say I make it look kind of something like this. Let's say the picture is, here's a paramecium, okay? And I draw like a big, bold circle around it, okay? Like this, and say, all right, the field, you're looking at this on high power where the field of view is 400 micrometers. What's the size estimate for this? And then the options would be 100 micrometers, 200 micrometers, 1,000 micrometers, 350 micrometers. Which one seems the most reasonable? 100, 200, 1,000, or 350? Yeah, 350 makes the most sense. If the distance all the way across this circle is 400, it's closer to 350, right? If something was only 100, it would only be about that big. If it was 200, it would be about that big, okay? And so on and so on. Make your size estimate, okay? That's how we do that. Okay, there'll also be a couple of things about microscopy, like some of the handling techniques. You know, how do you carry a microscope? Okay, what lens do you put back in viewing position when you leave it? All of that stuff is in your notes. Okay, so make sure you go over the handling of the microscope. This stuff is also multiple choice material. All right, third thing we went over, modes of nutrition. Okay, that was lesson 4. In lesson 4, we talked about chemoheterotrophs. Those are organisms that must consume organic material for food. Okay, so animals, fungi, bacteria, okay, things like that. And then the photoautotrophs, basically anything that uses photosynthesis to make its own food. So we need to know what each of those is. The context that we looked at that under was, why are there different structures in different cells? And this was also mentioned in your cell anatomy lab. It was basically the whole part of the analysis. So you have to be able to tell me, you know, things like, well, a chemoheterotroph, because they have to, you know, use organic material from other organisms, they've got to have lysosomes because those are an organ or an organelle that can digest food. A plant does not require these because it uses chloroplasts to carry out photosynthesis. So, okay, in order, like basically telling me basic functions of the cell, okay, that's kind of a big theme, second point in the cell theory, okay, that has to do with, okay, all of that kind of stuff. So cell theory, guys, is also a big one. I know we mentioned it up here, but I forgot to talk about it. Okay, the 3 points of the cell theory could be a multiple choice question, but they could also be part of explanations for written response items, just like what I did there, okay, where I said, you know, a chemoheterotroph, whose cells must carry out the basic functions of the organism, must digest food as a basic function. See, I've worked it into the answer. Okay, that's a good way to say, hey, Coder, I was really paying attention and I understand that cells carry out the basic functions of the organism. See how smart I am. Okay, you want me to think that, okay, when I'm reading your answer, and read your answer and go, hey, look at that person. They worked that thing into their answer, and that was good. Okay, everyone kind of follow on that? All right, so cell structure, that's what we were just talking about. Cell structure to do with the modes of nutrition, but also cell structure, we labeled the cell diagrams in that lesson as well. So I gave you those color printouts and we labeled all of them. Okay, not only do you need to know what the parts of the cell are, you also need to know what they do. And we did have 3 quizzes on that, okay, in this course, so make sure that that is something you know, because those will definitely be in part of the written response part of the test. Okay. Do you need to write a whole paragraph about what each structure does? No, your answers can be very similar to the ones you would have given on a quiz. As an example, function of the lysosome, digest food. Function of the chloroplast, carry out photosynthesis. Okay, easy stuff. All right, so cell structure, okay, that's what we just talked about. So being able to label a diagram of a cell, telling the difference between a eukaryotic cell, those are the ones that have compartmentalization, also an important term, okay, versus prokaryotic cells, like bacteria, that don't have, you know, nuclei and lysosomes and all that kind of stuff. Okay, questions so far? So sorry, I have compartmentalization here. Okay, so compartmentalization is part of that whole cell structure thing. Compartmentalization could be something that ends up in the multiple choice, like what does it mean? Okay, but it's also something that you might work into an answer in the written response about cell transport. Okay, cells have compartmentalization, which means materials have to travel from one place and another in a cell. And as a cell gets big, diffusion is kind of slow, right? So you can find ways to work two concepts together to really demonstrate your understanding and mastery of that material. Okay, cell transport. I'm most concerned about the big three. What were the big three? I mentioned one of them just a second ago. Active transport. Osmosis, diffusion, and active transport are the big three. So in the written response, questions about cell transport will be on those three things. So spoiler alert, there are questions in the written response about cell transport, about the big three. Okay, not only do you need to be able to identify what type of cell transport's going on in a given situation, but you also need to be able to explain how it works and then how it relates in the situation in that question. Okay, so that was the snails thing that I did just a minute ago there. Okay, we're talking about what if they were swimming around in this water that was really salty, what might happen? Okay, identify what process would be important there. All right, so diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So if something is moving by diffusion, that's a passive transport. Okay, it can transport anything. Anything can move by diffusion, but it only really happens within the cell. Okay, its drawbacks are that it's quite slow and that it's not targeted. And that is, of course, why cells can't get very big. Osmosis maintains water balance. Right? So water will move across the membrane towards salt concentrations. So if there's more salt outside of the cell, then water moves out of the cell and the cell will shrivel up. Okay? If there's no salt outside of the cell, water will rush into the cell and eventually the cell will pop. Okay? Things like that. So being able to explain what is it, okay? Why does it happen? And for osmosis, the key things are it's only water, it's passive, and it's across the membrane to balance salt. Right? Active transport is the only one that requires energy. These two are passive. This one, the cell expends energy to pump material across the membrane to make the concentration inside the cell greater than outside the cell. Okay, so again, those will be situational questions. You will have to identify, okay, from that situation what cell transport process is occurring, explain it, and then tell me how it relates to that particular problem. All right. Multicellularity, okay, we talked about that. What were the advantages? What were the, well, we didn't talk about very many disadvantages, mostly just advantages, okay? To be multicellular means that you have specialization. That is, the cells within the organism are different. Some cells do this job better, some cells do that job better. They are specialized to do that job, okay? What were the advantages of multicellularity? Right, okay? Being multicellular meant that you could have small cells with good surface area to volume ratios where diffusion works well, but the overall organism could be big. Okay? A single cell can only achieve a certain size before its surface area to volume ratio becomes too poor, diffusion won't work well, and the cell will die. Okay? All right, so that's an important thing. Okay, advantages, surface area to volume ratio. Okay, definitely something that if there was a question about that, there is in the written response. There is in the written response. Okay, then you would certainly want to mention surface area and volume. You'd want to mention diffusion. Okay, explaining to do with that situation how that works. Okay. Also, in terms of multicellularity, I could also give you a question where I show you a multicellular organism, maybe showing some of the different kinds of cells, and ask you, okay, why is this an example of a multicellular organism? Explain how, the structure of this organism shows those things. And we talked about how we have specialization, we have differentiation, okay, all of that kind of stuff. So make sure you're ready to talk about that kind of stuff. Okay, because there'll be a question about multicellularity, okay, a written response problem, and there'll be a written response problem about cell transport, surface area to volume. Okay, so examples of specialization in plants would be the layers of the leaf. And we talked about the layers of the leaf a bunch of times. The epidermis secretes the cuticle, and the palisade layer carries out photosynthesis, and so on and so on. So if you were talking about multicellularity, this is the example of a multicellular organism we talked about the most. Probably a good idea to review that so you can talk about that in an answer about multicellularity. Okay, we also talked about like the guard cells and the stomate and all of that. They were all examples, okay, of that. Okay, then we talked about transport in plants. We've done a lab on plant transport, so it's an important concept. What cellular transport process is most important for getting water to move up a plant? Osmosis, right? As water evaporates through the stomates, salt gets left behind, the spongy layer gets salty, water wants to move there by osmosis to balance it, and because it's a polar molecule, we got cohesion and adhesion going on in which tubes? Xylem, right? Okay, the xylem tubes are the ones that transport water. Okay, so the water is hooked to each other by hydrogen bonds and pulled up by that osmotic pulling force. So be able to explain that because, man, plant transport is a big concept. There's a lot of marks on the test about that. Okay, so explain it in detail. Okay, apply your knowledge. Okay, in that particular question, talk about xylem and phloem. Okay, because the phloem is the one that carries the sugary sap from the leaves back down to the roots to feed them. Okay, things like that. Definitely be able to work in all of those concepts into an answer. Okay. So while there might be some multiple choice stuff, like xylem, phloem, that kind of stuff, there's also going to be written response items about that concept. All right, and then parts of the plant. Okay, phloem and xylem. Okay, know them. Know like roots, stem, leaves. Know how they work. Okay, probably the different types of root systems. That's been on every plant quiz that you've had so far. Okay, so taproot and fibrous root. And okay, I would say that lignin is also probably, because it's that chemical that cements the cell walls together and strengthens the plant stem. Okay, that's another part of a plant that you probably want to work in there. Okay, the guard cells and the stomate, another part of a plant you definitely want to be familiar with, okay, because there will be questions about how plants regulate their water loss. Okay, now there's regulate water loss or manage water loss or whatever, okay, but obviously the stomates are probably the most important structure in terms of controlling the amount of water that evaporates, but also that layer that covers all the leaves, the cuticle, okay, that's also important, and things of that nature. Okay, so know the phloem and xylem, where they are, inside versus outside of the stem. Okay, what do they transport? What forces are involved? Obviously, we talked about that already. Okay, so make sure you know that stuff. Okay, plant growth and development. Okay, adaptation, hormones, tropisms. Okay, there will definitely be a written response question that will show you a warped looking plant. Okay, it'll give you a description of the situation that that plant is in. Read the description carefully and be able to identify what tropism is happening, how that tropism occurs. Well, all tropisms occur essentially in the same way. Okay, that's differential rate of growth on both sides of the plants. Which hormone is most responsible for that? Might want to look that one up. That'll be kind of important too. Okay, there's one hormone that's more important for tropism than all the others. Okay, make sure you know which one it is. Okay, talk about how a tropism works. Okay, how it happens, not so much why it happens. Okay, if it's geotropism, it's gravity. That's the why. Okay, the how is the important part as well. Okay, so if I gave you that question, here's a warped looking plant, here's the situation, and the question would say, identify what tropism is going on, why this tropism occurs, okay, and then how this tropism occurs. If all you write is geotropism, so it'll be straight up again, you might get 2 out of 5. Might. Okay, but if you say it's geotropism, it's a growth response to gravity. It helps the plant balance itself and become oriented so it won't fall over or break. This is accomplished by making one side grow faster than the other. Blah blah blah. That's a much more thorough answer. Okay, that's working towards the correct number of points to make for 5 marks. Okay. All right. And then again, how do they adapt to their environments? Okay, things like that. And I would say we did just a few days ago talk about the factors that affect plant growth. Okay, amount of sunlight, amount of water, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, certainly that's something you could work into some of your answers about plants as well. All right, just going to let you know exactly how many questions are on there because I don't remember now. Okay, so there are 26 multiple choice questions. Okay, and like we talked about, they have to do with everything from, like who came up with the cell theory, microscopy, structure of cells, okay, structure of plants. Basically, it's a lot of recall and things like that. And then in the written response, there are 9. There are 9 written response items. Okay, and we were talking about what those. Okay, we talked about how plants regulate the amount of water that they lose by evaporation. Okay, we talked about tropisms being on there, labeling the parts of a cell, okay, and telling me what they do. Multicellularity. Okay, transport in plants, transport in cells, plant adaptations, okay, and cell size and functioning. Okay, so those are the kind of things that are going to be in there. Okay, and they vary in mark value. Okay, you got some questions that are out of 6 marks. Okay, where you have to explain a bit more, and some questions are only out of like 3 marks, so they don't require as much explanation. Okay, make sure you look at the point value. It's always in brackets at the end of the question. Evan. There's 53 marks in the written, 26 multiple choice, 79. I think your chem test was out of 88. Okay, so this is, I don't know that it's necessarily shorter than your chem test, but okay, there's a bit more writing on this one. So make sure that you're kind of planning your time. Which part of it should you do first? Yeah, definitely do the written response first. Okay, there's more marks there. You can't rush the multiple choice. You can rush the multiple choice. Okay, the multiple choice is pretty straightforward. Okay, it's not very difficult, and you'll probably be able to get through the multiple choice like 3 questions a minute. Really, like it'll go fast. Okay, but the written response you need to take your time on and be thorough. Okay, when you're answering those questions. All right, any questions from you? Anything you want me to cover in a little bit more detail? Anything you want to ask about? Okay, well, as I always do, okay, I always give you whatever is left in class to do some of your own review and preparation for the exam in the hopes that that will lead to some more questions to answer. Okay, so I would say good idea would be to go to Google Classroom, to the unit exam review package. Okay, so I've got the old exam questions in there, the key for the old exams, okay, and the unit exam review. All right, so basically there's some stuff kind of like what we just did, major concepts, minor concepts, some other example questions. Okay, I would say maybe work on this one. Okay, if you don't have anything else planned for how you're going to review for your unit exam right now, okay, probably going through this would be a good idea. Okay, I would say want something like that. All right, so let's make good use of our time, okay, and then you'll get to keep doing that. If not, then I'll just start teaching physics.